The briefing room aboard the Ardent Meridian smelled like recycled air and quiet desperation, which Marcus Thane had come to understand was simply the default atmosphere of diplomatic missions. He sat at the end of the long obsidian table while 3 different people spoke at him simultaneously, a condition he had learned, after 11 years of interstellar envoy work, to receive with the outward calm of a man listening to light rain. The Vayari High Council has confirmed the Hall of First Breath as the signing location, said Attaché Priya Solano, scrolling through her data slate with the focused energy of someone who had not slept since leaving the hegemony's outer relay station. Which means the acoustic protocols will be active, which means nothing we say in that room goes unrecorded, which means you should all say intelligent things, Marcus offered. Priya did not look up. Which means every word carries treaty weight, Marcus. Every word. Across the table, Chief Protocol Officer Hendricks cleared his throat in the particular way that preceded a remark nobody had asked for. I want to raise again for the record the matter of the mask. The mask in question sat on the table in front of Marcus. Burnished silver, contoured to cover everything from the bridge of the nose upward, with faint engravings along the brow that depicted the tidal maps of Calum Drift in miniature. It was, objectively speaking, a handsome piece of craftsmanship. It was also, according to everyone in this room except Marcus, a diplomatic liability of the first order. The Vayari facial verification custom is not decorative, Hendricks continued. It is embedded in their treaty law going back 4 centuries. The signing requires the unmasked face of each party's representative. It is how they confirm personhood. It is how they establish trust. I'm aware, Marcus said. Then you understand that arriving masked, I'll be arriving as myself, Marcus said, in the same tone he might use to observe that the coffee was adequately warm. Which happens to include the mask, yes. Hendricks made the sound of a man swallowing something that disagreed with him. Priya finally looked up from her slate. The tradition was not theater. On Calum Drift, the colony where Marcus had been born and raised under the low amber light of a star that the rest of the hegemony considered too distant to care about, you did not show your face to a stranger. Not because of vanity, not because of law. Because a face, unguarded and offered freely, was the most honest thing a person could extend. And honesty, like any valuable thing, required the right moment and the right recipient. You gave it when the ground was solid. You did not scatter it at the feet of people you had just met, regardless of their titles. The hegemony's cultural sensitivity training acknowledged this tradition in a single footnote. Marcus had read the footnote. He had chosen to find it funny. The Queen will ask you to remove it, Priya said carefully. Probably, he agreed. And when she does, I'll decline politely. The silence that followed had texture. Hendricks appeared to be mentally drafting his incident report in real time. Priya set her slate down with the precise care of a person preventing themselves from doing something more emphatic with it. Marcus, she said, she is a queen of an entire star system, with a fleet that our admirals describe, in classified documents I was not supposed to read but absolutely did, as discouraging. She sounds impressive, he said, and meant it. She will not be accustomed to being told no. Then it'll be novel for her. People enjoy novelty. Hendricks stood abruptly and walked to the viewport, which Marcus understood was his way of communing with the void rather than saying what he actually wanted to say. Outside, Vayer Prime was coming into resolution, the planet enormous and unhurried in its blue-green enormity, and above it, suspended in a gravitational arrangement that the Ardent Meridian's own engineers had spent the approach quietly arguing about, the palace. It was called the floating seat in the Vayari tongue, and the translation was almost certainly underselling it. It looked like someone had taught a storm to hold still and then furnished it. Vast, sweeping buttresses of a mineral that caught starlight and held it for a moment before reluctantly releasing it. Towers that appeared structurally optional, but were presumably there for reasons. Platforms stacked at intervals that suggested the architect had either been a genius or had been working from an incomplete set of plans and had decided confidence was the answer. It's something, Marcus said quietly. Priya appeared beside him. The atmospheric transit alone is going to take 40 minutes. The Vayari use a gravity fold entry sequence that our navigation AI has already filed 3 formal complaints about. Can an AI file formal complaints? Ours can. We've been meaning to look into that. He almost smiled. She almost did too. This was the rhythm they had found over the 3 weeks of transit. The finding of small absurdities in the enormous, serious business of making humanity legible to a civilization that had watched them with distant curiosity for decades before finally agreeing to talk. The Vayari were not hostile. They were not warm. They were, as far as anyone could determine, genuinely uncertain what to make of a species that had developed faster than light travel and still managed to have opinions about other people's ears. Marcus picked the mask up from the table and turned it in his hands. The tidal maps caught the light. Calum Drift's coastlines in miniature, the places he had grown up, the cliffs where his grandmother had taught him that the most important things you owned were the things you chose not to give away carelessly. He had been 12 years old. He had not fully understood it then. He understood it now with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent a career watching people perform themselves for audiences and forget which parts were performance. He put the mask on. The magnetic clasp settled with a soft sound against the back of his head. The world narrowed slightly at the periphery in the way he had long since stopped noticing. He looked at his reflection in the viewport glass. Silver face, human jaw, Calum Drift mapped across his brow, and found the image entirely acceptable. "Right," he said. "Shall we go meet a queen?" Hendricks turned from the viewport with the expression of a man who had made peace with the fact that this mission was going to generate a great deal of paperwork, and he would be the one to file it. "For the record," Hendricks said, "I want it noted that I raised the mask question." "Noted," said Priya. "Noted," said Marcus. The ardent Meridian began its descent toward the floating seat, carrying its small crew of diplomats and one man in a silver mask into the long, serious business of first contact with a queen who had, in all her considerable years of rule, never once been told no by anyone who intended to keep standing afterward. The Hall of First Breath was exactly as impossible in person as it had looked from the approach, which Marcus found both impressive and faintly aggressive, as though the architecture was making a point. The floor was a single, continuous piece of something that was not quite stone and not quite glass, dark and deep enough that looking down gave the mild vertigo of looking into water. The walls did not meet the ceiling so much as suggest it, curving upward into a luminous haze that the Vayari apparently generated through a photonic suspension system that Priya had explained during the descent and that Marcus had listened to with genuine interest and retained approximately none of. Light moved through the room at its own pace, unhurried, pooling in corners and then drifting. It was, Marcus thought, either the most beautiful room he had ever stood in or a very confident attempt at one. He was willing to give it the benefit of the doubt. The Vayari delegation was already positioned when the human party entered. 7 figures in deep ceremonial dress arranged in a precise formation that the protocol briefings had described as the configuration of receiving, which apparently conveyed both welcome and authority simultaneously. Marcus had privately thought this sounded like standing in a specific way while having opinions about yourself, but he kept this observation behind the mask where it belonged. And then there was the queen. Vayandra sat at the far end of the hall on a throne that appeared to be constructed from a mineral that actively held light rather than reflected it, so that she seemed to be seated inside a soft, continuous glow rather than beside one. She was, and Marcus registered this with the detached professional attention he applied to most things, genuinely striking. Blue skin with the depth of something that had been that color for a long time and intended to continue. Golden hair that moved with a faint, sourceless drift, as though it maintained its own atmospheric conditions. And her ears, long, tapering elegantly to fine points, angled slightly outward in a configuration the briefing notes had identified as formal receptivity, gave her face a quality of alert stillness, like someone listening to a frequency just outside the range of the conversation. She looked at Marcus. He could feel it through the mask. The formal greetings proceeded as formal greetings do, with great ceremony and the mutual pretense that everyone present was comfortable, There were words in Vayari that the translation nodes rendered into something approximating their meaning, though Priya had warned that Vayari diplomatic language operated on 3 simultaneous registers, and the nodes reliably caught 1.5 of them. The Queen's voice, even in translation, carried the specific quality of someone who had spent decades being listened to and had long since stopped accounting for the possibility of not being. It was perhaps 4 minutes into the formal exchange when she said it. Envoy Thane. Her translated voice was even, unhurried. The protocol of first breath requires that I see the face of those with whom I enter covenant. I ask that you remove your mask. The room did not change temperature. It simply felt as though it had. I'm grateful for the explanation, Marcus said. And I want to be clear that I mean no disrespect to the protocol or to you. But I won't be removing the mask. The silence that followed was the kind that had mass. He watched the Queen's long ears shift, a subtle movement, barely a degree, but he had been studying the briefing notes on Vayari physiological expression for 3 weeks, and he was fairly certain that particular angle meant something. He wished he could remember what. On his left, Hendrix had gone the color of old parchment. On his right, Priya was doing something with her jaw that suggested she was biting down on a response that was trying to escape. The Queen's expression remained composed. The mask is ceremonial in nature? Yes, Marcus said. Then the ceremony it represents has concluded. The hall is a space of covenant. Ceremony yields to covenant. In your tradition, absolutely. In mine, the mask remains until the ground between 2 people is solid enough to warrant its removal. We've only just met. There was a brief, charged moment in which the chief Vayari protocol officer, a tall figure with the bearing of someone who had professionally managed impossible situations and was now privately re-evaluating his career, turned slightly toward the Queen. His ears, too, moved. The briefing notes had not covered what that particular angle meant, and Marcus made a note to ask someone later, assuming there was a later. You are stating, the Queen said, with the careful precision of someone translating an improbable sentence into manageable components, that you will not comply with the Covenant Protocol. I'm stating that I'll engage with the Covenant Protocol in every way that doesn't require me to offer something I'm not yet in a position to offer. My face isn't a formality. It's not interchangeable with a signature or a thumbprint. Where I come from, showing it means something. Fayandra considered this. Her ears had settled into an angle he could not interpret at all. Behind the human delegation, someone shifted their weight, and a boot made a small sound against the not-quite stone floor that echoed with profound loneliness in the enormous silence. I think, Priya murmured, at a volume calibrated for Marcus alone, that might have been me. I'm very sorry. He did not react. Professionalism was a practice. The Queen set her hands on the arms of the throne with the deliberate quality of someone choosing to remain seated when standing was a temptation. Envoy Thane, I have governed this system for 30 years. I have received delegations from 47 civilizations across 6 stellar regions. The protocol of first breath has been observed without exception. I believe you, Marcus said, and I want you to know I find that genuinely impressive. 30 years is a long time. 47 civilizations is a significant sample size. I just won't be the precedent that holds. Hendrix made a sound. It was quiet and small and contained the compressed energy of a man who had opinions he was physically preventing himself from expressing. Marcus had always admired Hendrix's self-control, even while finding his opinions largely unhelpful. You understand, the Queen said slowly, that without facial verification, the treaty cannot be signed under Vayari Covenant law. I do. I'd very much like to sign the treaty. I wonder if we might discuss alternative verification methods. I understand Vayari Covenant law has some historical precedent for vocal resonance protocols, something from roughly 4 centuries ago if my research was accurate. The chief protocol officer's ears moved again. This time even Hendrix noticed, because Hendrix turned very slightly to look at them, which was not protocol, but understandable. The Queen looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then she said something in Vayari that the translation node rendered as a request for the room to be cleared, but which Priya later confirmed had also contained in the second register, an expression that translated approximately as I would like to look at this more closely. The delegation filed out with the controlled haste of people who were very relieved to be leaving and very uncertain whether relief was appropriate. Hendricks paused at the threshold long enough to look back at Marcus with an expression that communicated an entire paragraph of professional concern in a single glance. Marcus gave him a small nod. The great doors of the Hall of First Breath closed with a sound like a decision being made, and Queen Vayandra, sovereign of Vayar Prime, ruler of a star system and commander of a fleet that classified hegemony documents called discouraging, looked across the luminous impossible room at a man in a silver mask who had just told her no, and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to have its own weather. The silence between them had settled into something almost comfortable, which Marcus found surprising. Silences in diplomatic contexts were usually weaponized, stretched deliberately to create pressure, or filled too quickly by someone who couldn't tolerate the weight of them. This one was different. It simply existed, occupying the hall with the same unhurried quality as the light, and Vayandra let it exist without apparent need to end it on her terms. He found that interesting. He filed it next to the other things he had found interesting about her, which was becoming a moderately long list. She rose from the throne. It was not a dramatic movement. There was no sweep of ceremony to it, no performance for an absent audience. She simply stood, the way a person stands when they have decided to stop being formal and are not yet certain what to be instead, and walked toward the center of the hall, with the unhurried quality of someone who owned the floor beneath her feet in the most literal sense imaginable and had therefore never needed to think about it. She stopped at a distance that the briefing notes would have categorized as mid-range diplomatic, close enough for conversation, far enough for deniability. Her ears, he noticed, were angled slightly forward. "You researched our covenant law," she said. It was not quite an accusation and not quite a compliment, and sat interestingly in the space between them. 3 weeks of transit, Marcus said. I had time. Your legal archive is extraordinary for what it's worth. The organizational system alone took me 4 days to understand and another 2 to appreciate. Most delegations rely on their protocol staff for such things. Most delegations are trying to present a version of themselves. I was trying to understand a version of you. He paused. Professionally speaking. Her ears moved. That particular angle, he was becoming increasingly certain, was something he should know. He made another note to ask Priya, with more urgency than the last note. "The vocal resonance precedent you cited," Vayandra said. "You know it has not been invoked in 412 years. 416, by my count. Though I was working from a translation, so I'll defer to you." Something crossed her face that was not quite amusement, and not quite its absence. "You would defer to me on this, but not on the mask. Archival dates seem like a reasonable thing to defer on. My face does not." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with an attention that he imagined was rarely given to people whose faces she couldn't see. He wondered briefly what she was reading. The set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the fact that he hadn't moved his hands since the room was cleared, because he was aware of his hands in formal situations and kept them still deliberately. He wondered if any of this translated across the considerable biological distance between them, and then decided it probably did, because the things that read as human in a face or a body were rarely as species-specific as people assumed. "Tell me about Calum Drift," she said. Drift. He hadn't expected that. He was good at not showing what he hadn't expected, but he registered the surprise internally with something that felt like respect for her. She had pivoted cleanly and without announcement, the way someone does when they've decided that the direct route isn't the most useful one. "It's a colony world," he said. "Old settlement. About 400 years of continuous habitation, which makes it ancient by hegemony standards and unremarkable by yours, I imagine. Low amber star, long seasons, the kind of place where people developed very strong opinions about patience because the alternative was misery. And the tradition of the mask. And the tradition of the mask. Though it isn't called that. It doesn't really have a name. It's just what you do. You don't show your face to someone until the ground is solid, until you know the weight of them won't crack what you're standing on. He considered for a moment. It sounds more poetic in the original dialect. Most things do. Does the ground feel solid to you yet? She asked. The question arrived simply, without pressure or edge, and he appreciated the simplicity of it. It was the most honest thing either of them had said since the doors closed. It's getting there, he said. You cleared the room. That helped. I cleared the room because I wanted to understand you without 17 people recording their interpretations of you. I know, that also helped. Her ears had drifted to an angle he hadn't seen yet, something subtler, and he decided that he was going to compile an actual reference document on Veyari ear positions if he survived this mission, purely as a contribution to human scholarship, and not at all because he found them expressive in a way that was difficult to stop watching. Envoy Thane, she said, and there was something different in the way she said it now. Not the ceremonial weight of the title, but something closer to the way a person uses a name when they've decided to actually speak to you. In 30 years of governance, no one has refused a direct request of mine. I want you to understand the scale of what I'm telling you, not as a complaint, as a fact. I believe you, he said. How has it been? The 30 years? She looked at him. That is an unusual question. It seemed like an unusual conversation. She was quiet long enough that he wondered if he'd misjudged the pivot. Then, efficient, she said. It has been efficient. When no one refuses you, things move quickly. Decisions are made, systems function. There is very little friction. She paused. I had not considered until approximately 12 minutes ago that I might have been missing friction. Friction has a bad reputation, Marcus said, but it's the only reason anything stays where you put it. She turned away from him slightly, not withdrawing, but thinking, and looked toward the far wall where light was pooling and then releasing in its slow, indifferent cycle. He waited. He was good at waiting. Calum Drift had given him that much. My protocol staff, she said without turning back, is currently standing outside those doors, having what I suspect is a collective crisis. My chief officer has served me for 19 years and has, to my knowledge, never encountered a situation his training did not cover. He seems competent, Marcus said. His ears were very expressive. I couldn't read them, but they were moving with a lot of conviction. She turned back then, and the thing that crossed her face this time was unambiguous. She was amused. Genuinely, not diplomatically. The difference was legible, even across the significant gap of unfamiliarity between them. Her long ears rose slightly and then settled, and he thought that particular movement probably meant something warm. He would be distressed to know his ears were observable, she said. I won't mention it in my report. Your report. She said it as though she'd briefly forgotten there would be one, that this conversation existed inside a larger structure of institutions and records and hegemony oversight that would eventually want to know what had happened in this room. What will you say in it? That the Queen of Veyar Prime is more interesting than the briefing materials suggested, that her hall has excellent acoustics, and that the treaty discussion is ongoing. He paused. And that the vocal resonance protocol is worth exploring seriously, if your legal team is willing. I wasn't raising it as a deflection. I think it could work. She studied him for a moment with her ears angled forward again. That posture of close attention that he was increasingly certain was specific and meaningful and directed at him in a way that had nothing to do with protocol. You came here prepared to refuse me, she said slowly, and also prepared to solve the problem your refusal created. It seemed polite, he said. I wasn't going to just leave you with an impasse and wish you well. Most people who refuse a sovereign do so because they want the power of the refusal. They want to be the person who said no to a queen. I have no interest in that, Marcus said. I just have a face, and it's mine, and I'd like to give it at a moment that means something, not as a procedural checkbox on a treaty form. He paused. No offense to your treaty forms. They were very well designed. Your archivists are clearly exceptional. She laughed. It was short and genuine and appeared to surprise her slightly. Her ears rose, and this time he was almost certain. Almost. that it meant something in the vicinity of delight. The light continued its slow drift through the hall of first breath, unhurried and indifferent to diplomacy, and Marcus Thane stood in the center of it with his silver mask and his Calum Drift patience and waited to see what the ground between them would do next. The vocal resonance protocol, as it turned out, was not simple to invoke. This was established over the following hour through a process that involved Vayandra summoning her chief protocol officer, whose name, Marcus learned, was Sorveth, and whose ears had indeed been doing a great deal of expressive work throughout the day, along with 3 archivists, a covenant interpreter, and a legal specialist who had to be retrieved from another part of the palace entirely and arrived slightly breathless, carrying a document case and the expression of someone who had been told their expertise was needed for the first time in what might have been their entire career. Priya was recalled from wherever the human delegation had been waiting and arrived with the controlled energy of someone who had spent the intervening time productively and was now ready to be useful. Hendrix arrived behind her with the controlled energy of someone who had spent the intervening time preparing for disaster and was relieved to find the disaster had not yet fully materialized. The resonance protocol, Sorveth explained, in the careful register of a man presenting information he had retrieved under significant personal stress, requires that both parties submit a full vocal pattern to the Covenant archive. The pattern is read not merely for identity, but for, the translation is imperfect, something approximating sincerity. The archive was designed with the understanding that the voice, under the conditions of the hall, cannot deceive in the ways a face sometimes can. Marcus found this genuinely fascinating. The hall reads deception. The hall reads coherence, Sorveth corrected, with the precision of someone for whom the distinction mattered. Whether what a person says aligns with what their body knows to be true. It does not judge. It records the gap, if one exists. Priya looked at Marcus with an expression that said several things at once, the primary one being that this was either very good news or very complicated news, and she had not yet determined which. That seems fair, Marcus said. Sorveth's ears moved in what Marcus had provisionally catalogued as cautious agreement. The process takes approximately 40 minutes. There are spoken components, a formal covenant declaration, questions from the archive itself, which are generated individually and cannot be prepared for. Questions from the archive, Hendrix repeated slowly. The building asks questions. The archive, Sorveth said with diplomatic patience, is a resonance intelligence. It has been operational for 416 years. He paused, glancing briefly at Marcus. You were correct on the date. I checked. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement and did not make a remark about it, which cost him something small and personal. The preparations took time, as proper things do. The archivists arranged components of the protocol that involved a series of resonance nodes positioned throughout the hall, small devices that looked unremarkable until they were active, at which point they emitted a low, continuous frequency that Marcus felt more in his chest than his ears, like the room had developed a pulse. Priya stood beside him during the preparations and spoke quietly. The archive questions, she said. Sorveth said they can't be prepared for. Yes, that doesn't concern you. It concerns me precisely the right amount, he said, which is to say I've noticed it and I've put it somewhere useful. She considered this. That's either very wise or a very sophisticated way of being terrified. Probably both, he admitted. They're not mutually exclusive. Vayandra moved through the preparations with the ease of someone in a familiar process, speaking with her archivists in low Vayari that the translation nodes didn't bother with, making small decisions with gestures and single words. Occasionally, she glanced at Marcus across the hall with an attention that he had stopped trying to categorize and had simply begun to accept as a feature of the room, like the light. When everything was positioned, Sorveth announced that the protocol was ready. The room arranged itself, the delegations standing at respective distances, Vayandra and Marcus at the center, the resonance nodes breathing their low pulse into the floor and walls. The Covenant Declaration came first. Marcus spoke his portion in Standard, which the archive accepted through a translation filter that Sorveth assured him was lossless. He said the formal words about intent and good faith and the mutual recognition of sovereignty, and he meant all of them, which he suspected was the point. Then the archive asked its questions. The first question was for Vayandra and was spoken in Vayari, so Marcus received only the translation, which was, "Do you enter this covenant with the full knowledge that it will bind you to obligations you cannot yet fully anticipate?" She answered yes, without hesitation, and the resonance nodes held the frequency steady, which Sorvath's expression suggested was the correct outcome. The second question was for Marcus, and it arrived not in standard, but in something that the translation node rendered haltingly, as though even the technology found it complex. "Do you offer what you have given here freely, without the performance of freedom, because it is genuinely yours to give?" The hall was quiet. The low pulse of the resonance nodes continued. "Yes," Marcus said. He meant it in more directions than the archive was probably measuring. The nodes sustained their frequency for a long moment, and then the pitch shifted, barely a fraction upward, and Sorvath exhaled in a way that suggested the shift was favorable. The Covenant interpreter made a notation. The three archivists exchanged a look that Marcus could not read, but that seemed to carry the particular satisfaction of people watching an old thing work correctly for the first time in a long while. The treaty was signed with vocal imprints, recorded into the archive's living memory, witnessed by both delegations and by 416 years of Vayari Covenant intelligence that had apparently been waiting with considerable patience for someone to finally invoke it properly. Hendricks, to his considerable credit, did not say anything. He simply stood with his hands clasped and his expression composed, and only someone who had worked with him for years would have recognized the look beneath the composure as genuine relief rendered almost indistinguishable from dignity. Priya caught Marcus's eye across the room and gave him a look that communicated 3 weeks of transit, all that preparation, and I cannot believe that actually worked in a single expression. He acknowledged it with a small nod that communicated "I know." She turned back to her slate before either of them did something unprofessional with their faces. When the formal conclusion was announced, the delegations began the slow ceremonial process of dispersal. Sorvath was already engaged with the archivists, his ears moving in what Marcus had come to recognize as a register of professional absorption. The look of a man filing an experience away into the part of himself that would take considerable time to fully process. Vayandra crossed the hall toward Marcus with the same unhurried quality she'd had throughout. No performance in it, no announcement. She stopped at the distance that had become theirs over the course of the afternoon, the space between strangers that had been quietly, incrementally renegotiated. "The archive found you coherent," she said. "I'm relieved," he said. "I had a reasonable amount of faith in that outcome, but it's good to have it confirmed externally." "It has not found everyone coherent," she said. "In its operational history, I thought you should know that. How does it handle incoherence?" "It records the gap and proceeds anyway," she said. "It is an archive, not a judge, but the Covenant carries the notation." That seems like a civilized approach to human or any imperfection. She looked at him for a moment with her ears angled forward in that posture he had spent the day watching, the one that meant close attention, that meant she was reading something carefully and finding it worth the effort. "You'll submit your report to the hegemony," she said. "They'll want to understand what happened here today." "They'll want to understand the treaty," he said. "What happened in this room, I think, belongs to this room." Something settled in her expression. Not surprise. She had moved past surprise with him some hours ago, but something quieter and more considered. Her long ears rose slightly, that warm movement he had catalogued in the third hour of knowing her as something in the vicinity of genuine feeling. "The ground," she said. "Is it solid enough yet?" He had known, in the abstract way of a man who prepares for things, that the question would return. He had not known, until this moment, what his answer would feel like when he gave it. It felt like Calum Drift's amber light. It felt like his grandmother's cliffs and the things that are worth keeping because you kept them carefully. He reached up and unclasped the mask. It came away with the same soft sound it had made that morning aboard the Ardent Meridian. A small mechanical release, the end of a held breath. He held it at his side and looked at Queen Veandra of Vayar Prime across the solid ground of an afternoon spent in the difficult and worthwhile work of becoming legible to another person. She looked at his face for a long moment without speaking. "Well," she said finally, and there was something in her voice that had not been there at the beginning of the day, a warmth that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the specific afternoon that had produced it. It was worth waiting for. "Most things are," he said, "if the ground is right." Behind them, the resonance nodes went quiet one by one as the archivists deactivated them. The hall returned to its natural light, which drifted and pooled and released in the same unhurried patterns it had maintained for centuries, indifferent to treaties and masks and the small, significant distances between people that get crossed, when they get crossed at all, by patience and the willingness to mean what you say. Hendrix, from across the hall, noticed. He looked at Priya. Priya looked at him. Neither of them said anything, which was the most professional thing either of them had done all day, and they had both had a very professional day. Marcus Thane walked out of the Hall of First Breath, carrying his mask at his side, into whatever came next, which was, for the first time in a long while, genuinely interesting to him. Not as a diplomat, not as a hegemony envoy with a report to file and a vessel to return to. As a person who had gone to a distant star to negotiate a treaty and had come back with something that had not been on any of the briefing documents, and that he suspected was going to require considerably more visits to Vayar Prime to understand properly. He found he had no objection to this whatsoever.